Episode 7, July 17th to August the 6th, 1914. My First Days at War, by Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, GCB, Commodore of the Submarine Service in 1914, read by Colin Mackenzie. In 1914, Sir Roger Keyes, who later was to play such a distinguished part in command of the Dover Patrol, was in charge of the submarines. His name will ever be associated with the Dardanelles and the valiant naval actions at Zeebrugge and Ostend. Here he tells of his earliest war experiences with the British Navy. In October 1913 it was decided, mainly in the interests of economy, not to have the usual naval manoeuvres in 1914, substituting in their place a test mobilization of the Third Fleet, the cost of the latter being well covered by the economies which would be effected in fuel consumption. This entailed the calling up of some reserves of 20,000 officers and men, and the arrangements for their reception, kitting up, and drafting of such numbers occupied the naval depots for some time beforehand. The ships of the Third Fleet, which were swinging around their buoys on the Mother Bank and elsewhere, with very small maintenance crews on board, were in the ordinary course by no means ready for service, and the dockyards were engaged for some months in thoroughly overhauling and refitting them, with the result that when orders were issued for the test mobilization on July the 10th, and the fleets assembled at Spithead between July the 13th and 17th, the whole pre-war navy was practically on a war footing, manned and in all respects ready for service. This was an amazing stroke of good fortune, or perhaps it was conscious or subconscious provision on the part of the First Lord, who was entirely responsible for initiating this unprecedented innovation. The King was to have joined the fleet on July the 17th, but at the last moment his departure from London was postponed on account of the Irish situation, which was very serious. However, he arrived on the 18th, accompanied by Mr. Asquith, the Prime Minister, in time for a dinner party on board the Victoria and Albert, to which I was invited. I remember remarking that the King and Mr. Asquith were in very good spirits, and that an air of optimism prevailed, which surprised me, as the Irish question seemed to have arrived at an absolute deadlock. But this was explained the next day by the publication of His Majesty's appeal to all parties to confer at Buckingham Palace. On the 19th I dined on board the Enchantress with the First Lord, and after dinner went on with Sir George Callaghan to the Iron Duke, where I remained as his guest until July the 25th. On the 20th the whole fleet sailed in single line ahead, passing close to the Victoria and Albert, anchored off the Nab. His Majesty took the salute from each ship as she passed, after which he signalled his approval, concluding with the word, "I am proud of my Navy." I wrote a pencil note opposite this record less than a month later. I hope he'll be able to say the same at the end of the war. I left the Iron Duke that day to spend a weekend at home in Fareham, with no thought of the European situation, but after reading the Sunday papers I had a most definite foreboding that war was upon us. The crews of the submarine flotillas were due to go on leave by watches on the following day. I gave orders that leave was not to commence until further notice, and went up to London by early train on Monday to see the Chief of the War Staff, who gave me a message from the First Sea Lord, directing me to get the submarines ready for service directly the first watch returned from leave, the leave of the second watch to be postponed. Similar orders were issued to all destroyer flotillas. Prince Louis was much relieved when I told him that I'd already stopped all leave, the submarines were fully manned, and could proceed to their war stations at once. I then urged that the overseas flotillas should be moved into the North Sea, and the Dover Patrol flotilla to its station, but I could get no decision up to the time I left London that evening. When I reached home, I found my wife and our Goodwood party were starting for a dance in a country house a few miles away. To my relief, orders had arrived for the submarines to proceed to their stations, and when all arrangements had been made, I went to the dance at about 11 p.m., feeling convinced that we were going to war, or at least if we did not, we would be perfide Albion indeed. Several officers were recalled from the dance to rejoin their units. One after another, submarine officers came up to my wife to say goodbye and be wished Godspeed. One has since heard the dance described as a miniature of the Duchess of Richmond's ball before Waterloo. There was a curious, tense atmosphere about the Goodwood party of soldiers, sailors, and womenfolk, which was difficult to put into words. But of course no one had the remotest idea of the magnitude of the upheaval into which the world was heading. Tyrwhitt, who was there, received a telegram from the Commander-in-Chief ordering him to go to Portland as soon as possible. The next day he returned through Fareham on his way to Portsmouth, having telegraphed me to meet him, in order that he might hand me a secret packet from Sir George Callahan, containing the 8th Flotilla's war orders. That evening Sir George telegraphed me to meet him at the Admiralty the following morning, Wednesday, July the 29th. I did not see my home again until I returned from the Eastern Mediterranean in June 1916, except for a few hours in October 1914 and a few days in November 1915. I spent some time with Sir George Callahan, under whose orders the 8th Flotilla, overseas submarines, was to operate in the event of war. Later in the day, July the 29th, I learnt, much to my annoyance, that owing to some misunderstanding, the 8th Flotilla had been ordered to the Humber instead of its proper war station at Harwich. The former was, in my opinion, thoroughly unsuitable for its pace, and I asked permission to move it at once. I was told I could, subject to the Commander-in-Chief's approval. I did not succeed in getting in touch with him until about 10 p.m., when he gave me a free hand to do what I wished. I just had time to catch the last train to Grimsby that night and arrived there at 5 a.m., then went on by workman's train to Immingham, where I found the Maidstone at the Adamant and 10 D and E-class submarines. I hoisted my broad pennant on the Maidstone and took the whole flotilla to Harwich, where we arrived safely on July the 31st, much to my relief. The Maidstone carried spare torpedoes and parts of machinery for all the overseas submarines, and was invaluable as a base for the 8th Flotilla. Her loss would have been a very serious matter, and I did not wish to risk her at sea after the outbreak of war. Besides, however remote, one could not disregard the possibility of a stroke before the declaration of war, such as the Japanese attack on the Russian fleet off Port Arthur. On the evening of August the 4th, I received the signal that an ultimatum had been given to Germany, which expired at midnight. I assembled all the officers and men of the submarines and informed them that we would be at war in a couple of hours, told them briefly the cause of the war, and said I felt all they had done in the way of fitting themselves for service by taking war risks during the past 3 years would now be rewarded. They gave a tremendous cheer. Admiral Campbell, who was under way in the Bacchante, with the Aboukir and the Euryalus in company, asked to meet me off the Kentish Knock, and I went on board to make the final arrangements. The weather was wet and beastly, and the Bacchante was incredibly dirty, having left the dockyard immediately after taking in stores, ammunition and coal, and I found the atmosphere rather depressing. Algy Boyle, afterwards Admiral Sir Algernon Boyle, was quite untouched by his surroundings, and when I next went on board the Bacchante, she had found herself. Whilst I was on board, a wireless message was received, which reported as 3rd Flotilla engaging scouting cruisers. As support might be required, I returned to the lurcher and steamed full speed to the northward in order to try and lay the submarines on to the enemy. It was, however, a false alarm due to a coding error. The vessel engaged was the Königin Luisa, which was sunk by the Amphion and some of her flotilla after she had laid a number of mines. It turned out afterwards that she intended to pass as a Hook of Holland Harwich packet and lay mines off Harwich, but on sighting the destroyers had turned to the northeast and then the north, laying her mines as fast as possible in the open sea, nowhere near our territorial waters. On the morning of August the 6th, the German ambassador and his staff arrived by train and embarked for the Hook of Holland in the GER packet St. Petersburg. I asked the marine superintendent to instruct the captain to manoeuvre his ship as if he were passing through intricate channels in a minefield. I was told later that he played his part very realistically and greatly intrigued the German naval attaché. During the night of the 5th and 6th, the Amphion reported that she was returning at about 9 a.m. with her flotilla and about 20 prisoners of war. But about an hour after she was due, a signal was received from Captain Fox of the Amphion that he was in the Llewellyn and had important news to communicate. On this we could put only one interpretation, which was confirmed when the war signal station reported that the flotilla was in sight without the Amphion. Shortly afterwards it was reported that the destroyers had turned up and were apparently engaging an enemy. It appeared that the St. Petersburg, carrying the German ambassador, looked exactly like the Königin Luisa, and, as she was flying a large German flag, the flotilla rushed at her open-mouthed, which was not surprising, as they had just seen their captain, to whom they were devoted, lose his ship on a mine laid by the Königin Luisa. Luckily they were stopped by Fox, but they seriously alarmed the embassy party, and the German flag came down like a rocket stick.
Goodbye, goodbye, when the tree may be dear from your eye, though it's hard to part, I know. I'll be taken to death, I know. Don't cry, don't sigh, there's a silver lining in the sky. Bonsoir, old thing, chilly old chin-chin, now poop-toodle-oo, goodbye. Brother Bertie went away to do his bit.